Welcome to the Pharmacy Inspection Podcast, where we discuss topics related to sterile and non-sterile compounding pharmacy in an effort to promote compliance and increase quality. The Pharmacy Inspection Podcast is a member of the Pharmacy Podcast Network, delivering quality and meaningful conversations and discussions about our pharmacy industry and the critical role pharmacists play in our healthcare systems. Learn more at pharmacypodcast.com. Please welcome your hosts, Brian Prince and Seth DePasquale.
Hello and welcome to all of our compounding friends and colleagues to the Pharmacy Inspection Podcast, where we discuss all things compounding in an effort to bring to you, our audience, relevant industry information to keep raising the bar. This week you might be listening to us through iTunes or iHeartRadio, possibly through the Pharmacy Podcast Network, or even through our website at pharmacyinspection.com. Regardless of your preferred media outlet, we say thank you for joining us. And we ask for your feedback every week on our show's content. Tell us what information is most relevant to you and how can we get it to you. So we appreciate your feedback. This week, we welcome Dr. Loyd Allen, who's the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Pharmaceutical Compounding. That is our industry's most scientific and technical journal that offers hands-on compounding technique, peer-reviewed articles, and really should be a staple in all of our pharmacies. Dr. Allen has been in this industry for decades, and in that time he has contributed a wealth of knowledge through the journal, through his own consulting, and his advising through industry associations, and even on an FDA committee for compounding. Dr. Allen has a lot of information to share with us, and so we welcome him. We thank you for joining us this week. Dr. Allen, tell us about yourself.
First of all, I attended the University of Oklahoma College of Pharmacy, received the BS in Pharmacy in 1966, and at that time it was a 5-year program plus an additional year of internship prior to taking your pharmacy license exam. Back in those days, part of those hours could be done in the summers between semesters, so you could become licensed between 5 and 6 years, during pharmacy school. Immediately after I graduated, went into the U.S. Public Health Service and did a hospital pharmacy residency in Boston, Massachusetts, at the Brighton Marine Hospital, and completed that, and that also had time spent at the National Institutes of Health, which is also under the Public Health Service. And anyway, following that year of training, I spent a year as a pharmacist on the Navajo Reservation at Chinle, Arizona. And it was during this time that we had 2 pharmacists and 4 physicians and other personnel, but being isolated on the reservation like that, you work very, very closely with the physicians, and you were, pretty close to the same age, and so we actually did a lot of minor surgery and, clinical things, and the young docs were always interested in pharmacy and asking questions, and so it was a good time. Following that, I went back to the University of Oklahoma for a master's in hospital pharmacy, because that was what I, was kind of interested in following my hospital pharmacy residency. And then after I finished that, I did some postmaster's work in health administration. And then a few months later, entered the PhD program at the University of Texas College of Pharmacy in Austin, where I obtained my PhD degree in physical pharmacy and, believe it or not, a lot of courses in clinical pharmacy. My advisor there was very active in clinical pharmacy. This is back in the 70s. Well, it was between 70 and 72 that I was there, and After receiving my PhD degree, I interviewed for teaching positions for both to head up clinical pharmacy programs, believe it or not, or to teach as a pharmaceutics professor. And I also interviewed for industry positions in formulation development and things like that. But anyway, ended up coming to the University of Oklahoma College of Pharmacy, where I taught, and I was there about 30 years. And at the end, I was chair of the Department of Medicinal Chemistry and Pharmaceutics, and had finished up about 25 PhD and master's students, and taught a lot of the pharmaceutics courses, dosage forms courses, pharmaceutical analysis classes. In fact, I taught drug analysis for the entire Health Sciences Center, for graduate students in other fields too. So it was pretty interesting. So anyway, back in the mid-'90s, I was very active with the American Pharmaceutical Association, serving in the Academy of Pharmaceutical Research and Science, and on the board of directors and things. And so in April of 1996, I was at a leadership meeting there, and another individual and I were at dinner one evening, and we were talking about compounding. As far as compounding is concerned, I've always been really interested in compounding and had an extremely good professor when I was an undergraduate student, as Professor Jean Brown. She was very interested in formulation development, compounding, and so she ran us through the mill pretty good. But it was always an interest of mine, and so in the 1980s, a colleague of mine, we started publishing formulas in the U.S. Pharmacist. This is back in like 88, I think it was, in the U.S. Pharmacist, and so that kind of was a good segue into compounding. I'd always taught the formulations classes and things, and so that was going along, but this was during the time period when compounding was experiencing a resurgence. It's interesting that when I graduated with my first degree in '66, there was not a whole lot of compounding going on because there were a lot of drug products commercially available on the market, and so there wasn't quite the need for compounding. But being interested in hospital pharmacy, of course, IV admixtures and, stuff like that was of great interest. And that was compounding, but a lot of people didn't really consider that as compounding at that point in time, because a lot of the IVs were prepared on the nursing stations by the nurses. Keep in mind this is back in the 60s. But then, as things progressed and compounding was starting to increase, and there was companies, that were being developed to help train and support pharmacy compounding. And so getting into compounding by writing articles about compounding and publishing formulations and stuff, this individual and I were at dinner that night, and we started talking that, it's about time for a specific journal in compounding, because there was no journal that was devoted to pharmacy compounding. And so he worked for one of the large companies that supported compounding. And so one of the individuals, in fact, he was the head of the company, invited me down to discuss what I had in mind as far as a compounding journal. And I explained to him that I thought that it needed to be a scientific as well as a practice journal, have a lot of good application in it, and it should be published by a totally independent entity that had no ties to anybody, totally independent. And so that individual, who was very, very, business astute, he actually set up the corporation. And of course, one of the requirements was nobody that was a part of any of the companies like that could own any stock. It was all by individuals, pharmacists, etc. And so that's how the IJPC.org was actually created, with 25 shareholders. And with that meeting, we had our leadership meeting in April. The meeting down with the organization was the following month, and people were hired, and we had our first organizational meeting, I think it was in June or July, and we came out with the first issue in January of 1997, just a few months later. And so, of course, now that was 22 years ago. We're now in our 22nd year of publication. But the journal is owned by independent shareholders. None of the big pharmacy support companies, none of them own anything. We're totally independent of all that. We're independent of all organizations. We're not owned by, IACP or APHA or ASHP. We are totally independent and self-sustaining, through subscriptions, and advertising, sales and things like that. So that is basically how IJPC was started, and it's been in the publishing business now for 22 years.
What sort of shifts have you seen over the last, couple decades, if any, within IJPC? Like, did you at first started focusing on, hospital pharmacy, and now have kind of shifted into more high risk stuff? Because I noticed there are a lot of, it's a great journal. I love it. So there's just so many. You're catering to such a large, very wide crowd. Even within compounding, it's actually it's a huge spectrum. So how have you noticed any shifts in the market, and then how have you guys responded to that?
Yeah, it's interesting. When we set up the journal, there was resistance, because a lot of the people that were in compounding didn't want to share. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
This was their area, and they didn't want other people coming into it. Well, by looking at the horizon back then, it was going to be evident, or it was evident, that there was going to be some issues coming up, and so compounding needed to have a real solid base. The purpose of the journal has always been to promote quality compounding. And honestly, there were some things going on back in the 70s, 80s, which were not great. They were, in many cases okay, but not of the highest quality, obviously. And that was simply a carryover with how things had been done for so many years. I know when I was in my residency in Boston, I was making rounds one day, and I was up on a nursing station, and the nurse was making an IV, and she had a liter of dextrose 5% in water, and this was the glass bottle, and she had, pulled the top off, and it stuck a 50 cc syringe, down one of the holes, and the plunger was pulled out, and she had popped the top off of a vial and was literally pouring it down using the syringe as a funnel. And this was an IV admixture. And so, this was during the time that pharmacy started looking at, hey, this is something that we need to be doing inside the pharmacies and hospitals. And so, there's a big push to get the IV additive services inside the pharmacies. And so the interesting thing when we started the journal, the primary group of people that we were addressing at that point in time was pretty much the independent community pharmacies, because they were the area that was growing so rapidly, and also back in the 90s, etc., and early 2000, a lot of hospital pharmacies still did not consider that they compounded anything, even though they had big IV additive services going and stuff like that. And so that was a group that was a little harder to impact. But anyway, as we continued to grow in the area of non-sterile and sterile, because obviously there's a lot of sterile compounding going on outside of hospitals, and so as we were growing there, then hospitals, especially with 795, 797, and everything being written on compounding, pretty much became aware of the fact that IV additive services are compounding services. They're sterile compounding services. And so over the years, we have expanded our expanded our focus, is okay to say, to really encompass a lot of hospitals, as well as independent, as well as chain, as well as specialty type pharmacies. And so you're exactly right. It is a big area, and it's difficult to cover everything. But, like I said, we've already completed 21 years, and we still have a lot of areas that have not been covered. So sterile, non-sterile, a lot of the things are similar, whether you're doing sterile in a hospital or doing sterile as a specialty pharmacy. There's a lot of similarities there. And again, back in the 90s and early 2000s, it was basically processes that were going on or activities that were going on, but there were really no standards that were well recognized. I mean, we had the ASHP, standards for sterile preparations and stuff, but most places were not really following that. Larry Trissell has mentioned that many, many times. And so it just got to the point that, we just cover both sterile and non-sterile, and it really doesn't matter which practice site you're in. A lot of the standards and the technology and the science behind it, are pretty much the same.
Yeah, Brian says that a lot about, the difference between manufacturing and compounding, because Brian has had some experience with setting up workflows and designing workflows and I think installing better work practices within manufacturing at big pharma.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of it is the same. It's the same stuff.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of carryover between everything that compounding entails. Brian, what do you have to say about that?
So I got into the containment side of pharmaceutical world, the manufacturing, the R&D side at that bench level back around 2009. And I was introduced to compounding pharmacy around 2012-ish, I guess. But prior to that time, I had walked the halls of the Merck's, Glaxo's, J&J's, biotherapeutics, and lots of those pharma-related companies, because that's where we engineered and designed containment. And more times than not, it was specific to personnel protection. So then when I got introduced into an industry relationship on the compounding side, I didn't know what a compounding pharmacy was. So I started venturing out. And when I would go to certain cities, like I would go see Merck in Memphis, Tennessee, I would stop in and see 3 or 5 different compounding pharmacies, not to sell them anything, but because I just needed to know. And what I started seeing, and I've said this many times in various conferences, what I started seeing is a lot of the same powder handling faux pas, because the way that they handle powder at the bench level at pharma is exactly the same way that they're handling at the pharmacy level. Now, I didn't address the our compounding community as manufacturers. Don't mishear what I just said. What I'm saying is that the principles and processes of formulation and safety and chemical handling and quality are basically the exact same principles. And so that's actually when I wrote a couple of papers that were published in the IJPC. So that was my first introduction, and I got to know Lauren over the years, and she's a super, super nice person. But one of the reasons why I wanted to write those papers and get them published at the IJPC was so that I could transfer that technology of good lab practices over to this industry. So it's interesting that you mentioned the journal was based on quality. That's what this podcast is, and this is what Seth and I, when we came together, is exactly our ideal. So this really is a great match for you to be on the podcast, and we certainly appreciate your time. So I'll park there and let somebody else interject.
We've talked a lot about quality, and that's that is my main focus and your main focus. What do you have any specific advice to a compounding pharmacy owner, pharmacist, or technician that compounds on compounding going forward?
First of all, one of the key things is to work closely with physicians. And one of the hardest things in the world to do is to make a cold call. But if you know the physicians beforehand through your, social structure, neighbors, meetings, and stuff like that, working with physicians is critical. It doesn't take too many of them to really help get you started. One of the things when I was in hospitals, I had physicians that would call down to the pharmacy all the time. And the reason is I would take the time to help them solve their patient problems. Well, doc, I know that this hasn't worked, but have you tried this, or this is an alternative? I read about a patient being treated this way, helping them solve their problems, and then, you got a friend there for a long time. Another real big thing is get involved in compounding organizations, especially IACP, because we're not big, but IACP is a governing, is a voice for everybody in compounding, and they really, support and promote compounding. Then one of the biggest things, too, is to read. Constantly read the new stuff that's coming out. Keep up to date on standards, regulations, and things like that, and work with your state boards of pharmacy. Attend meetings. Make yourself available for different committees and things like that. Those are, some things that I would really recommend. And then, if possible, try to work into an advisory board for College of Pharmacy nearby, and let them know what's going on, and that things need to change in academia.
Thank you, Dr. Allen, for coming on the podcast this week. I personally really appreciate your perspective and enjoyed speaking with you so much. So much so that we will have part 2 of our interview with Dr. Loyd Allen next week on the podcast. I'd like to let you know a couple things before we go, though. Brian and I will be at the upcoming American College of Apothecaries Annual Convention Expo, February 28th through the 3rd. Please stop by and say hello. We'll be recording for the podcast and would love to sit down with you to talk about compounding, to hear your perspective face to face. Brian will also be presenting on a great topic I know everyone will be very interested in. I also want to mention that I've started releasing flash briefings on the Alexa-enabled Amazon devices. A Quality Minute Compounding Brief is a weekly recording of a quality topic in 5 minutes or less. It's focused specifically on quality assurance and quality control to help you quickly raise the bar in your own pharmacy. These past few weeks have been focusing on environmental monitoring and how to accomplish that. I really appreciate everyone who's been listening to this podcast and the Quality Minute Compounding Brief. Do you have a question, comment, or topic, or guest that you'd like to hear on the show? Let us know. Tweet at Pharmacy Inspect, leave us a voicemail at pharmacyinspection.com, or email us at podcast@pharmacyinspection.com. Again, we really appreciate all the kind words of encouragement. We want to make this the best podcast we can, so please feel free to drop us a line and tell us what you'd like to hear. Until next time, keep raising the bar.